So let's start. Good afternoon and welcome to the first panel of the Multicultural Music Group Afro-Latin America Research Focus Group. I'm Alfredo Jose Burgos Matos, the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Multicultural Music Group, a Bronx nonprofit devoted to teaching history through music. We are joined by students from across New York City's universities who are interested in learning more about Afro-descendants and African heritage in Argentina. Thank you for being a part of this project. We do this educational work for you. The Multicultural Music Group functions through the concept of playing history. We commissioned renowned artists from the regions we study to compose original pieces for the Multicultural Music Encounters, which are the final celebration of our year's programming. This year taking place at Lehman College on June 9th and 16th. Composers get inspired by specialists in the field and their research. And today, you'll see that conversation between scholars and composers in real time. In other words, we strive to understand the socio-historical foundations of the theme for the year, Afro-Latin America in this case, and we commission artists to compose pieces about it. That way, we play history and look forward to enriching the communities we serve by sharing the symbiotic process between scholarship and composition. Without further ado, I'll introduce you to our panelists and jump right into the questions. First, we have Paulina Alberto, who is a historian of Afro-Latin American lives, thought, and politics as they unfolded in the aftermath of slavery, particularly in Brazil and Argentina. Her work explores the intersections of ideas of race and nation in Latin America, with a focus on how Afro-Latin Americans have shaped and contested the region's ideologies of racial inclusiveness in their ongoing struggles for recognition and equality. Alberto's latest single-authored work is Black Legend, The Many Lives of Raúl Grijera and the Power of Racial Storytelling in Argentina. Black Legend reconstructs both the life story of and the legends surrounding Raúl Grijera, a Black celebrity and icon of the Buenos Aires nightlife in the early 1900s. It examines the role of racial storytelling in constructing whiteness and Blackness in post-independence Argentina and the power of racial stories to shape the fates of individuals, communities, and nations. Her work has received support from the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council for Learned Societies, among other institutions. She is currently Professor of African and African American Studies and of History at Harvard University. On the other hand, Pedro Giraudo is a Latin Grammy Award winner, bass player, and composer who is among the most compelling tango artists today. After 2 decades performing with the most important interpreters of tango, Pedro debuted his own tango orchestra at Lincoln Center's Midsummer Night Swing in July 2015, and since then has become an active cultural ambassador of this beautiful and passionate music of his native Argentina. In 2018, his album Vigor Tanguero won a Latin Grammy Award for Best Tango Album. In 2014, Rubén Blades, I like to say CD Tangos, on which he recorded bass, won 2 Grammy Awards, Best Tango Album and Best Latin Pop. Pedro has collaborated with internationally renowned musicians such as Miguel Zenón, among others. As a composer and arranger, Giraudo leads his own jazz and tango ensembles and has been hailed by critics as one of the most creative and daring band leaders on the scene today. His compositions combine his love of classical forms, Argentine tango, and folk music, and the spontaneity of jazz improvisation. The band, which boasts some of New York's finest musicians, has performed regularly in the most prestigious jazz clubs in the New York City area, including the Jazz Standard, Birdland, the Jazz Gallery, Blue Note, Joe's Pub, as well as abroad. To conduct the questions today, I'll be joined by Leilah Ramos Arroyo, dance major at the Alvin Ailey School at Fordham University. Thank you everyone for being here. And to start us off, Professor Alberto, could you please offer 3 major aspects of the history of Afro-descendants in Argentina? And why are these events relevant?
Thanks so much, Wilfredo Jose, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. I wish I could see all of you, but I will just imagine your presence. So thanks for that question. The first major aspect of the history of Afro-descendants in Argentina that I think is important to emphasize is their substantial presence. Argentines and also many foreigners think that often think that Argentina is not really a part of the African diaspora, that it is not a significant part of the diaspora, or perhaps not at all. But in fact, in the late 1700s, toward the end of the period in which Argentina was still a colony of Spain, Buenos Aires and the neighboring port of Montevideo in what is now Uruguay became major ports in the transatlantic trade in African captives. And so between 1776 and 1810, these ports received an estimated 70,000 African men, women, and children, either directly from the African continent or also from Brazil, where people were brought either over land or by sea into the area, the territory that is now Argentina. And as my colleague, the historian Alex Borucki puts it, this was the most important demographic event in the history of the region that is now Argentina since Iberian colonization began more than 2 centuries earlier. So this was transformative. Afro-descendants accounted for 30% of the population of Buenos Aires and up to 50% of the population of some of the provinces to the northwest in the early 19th century. So I think that's really the first thing to emphasize, is that Argentina was and is part of the African diaspora. The second aspect I'd like to highlight is the role of Afro-descendants in the political history of these countries, but especially in Argentina, and the role in independence movements as well. So African and Afro-descendant men made up a significant proportion of the troops in the independence armies. In fact, about half of the troops under General José de San Martín, who famously liberated Argentina and then crossed the Andes into Chile to fight back the Spanish forces there. So you know, people of African descent, particularly men in the armies, were foundational to independence and the nation-building process and the many wars that entailed throughout the 19th century. And the third important aspect of the history of Afro-Argentines that I would like to emphasize is this process of forced assimilation and invisibilization to which Afro-Argentines have been subjected. And this is a process that, as I've explained before, took place from the mid-19th century onward and has resulted in what many people think is the disappearance of the Afro-Argentine population, if they acknowledge that there was one at all in the first place. But the thing that I want to highlight is that this process of forced assimilation did not make Afro-Argentines disappear. What happened, to put it very briefly, is really a broad process of cultural and racial mixture, like what happened in many other parts of Latin America. One that was declared to be white in its outcome, but that is in fact the process of really mixture among Europeans and people of indigenous origin and African origins. And so Argentina's population and its culture, its language, its music, its food is deeply shaped by Afro-descendant people and cultures, right? It's not that the Afro is a kind of niche in Argentine history. It's rather that these two things aren't separate, right? The Afro is a deep part of the component of who we as Argentines are today. Even those of us who don't claim descent from African people have been shaped in many ways by the presence of Afro-descendants on national territory.
Thank you very much for that. And to expand on that second point about the presence and role of Afro-descendants in the liberation movements in the region, could you talk a little bit more about that presence and about the contributions to those liberation movements?
Yes, so it beginning in the early 1800s, so Argentina, Buenos Aires and the provinces around it declared self-government in 1810, and then after several years of fighting, declared actual independence in 1816. And over the course of, almost a decade leading up to 1816, people of African descent, whether they were enslaved or free, were often conscripted by the Patriot forces to join the army. Some of them joined at will because they had their freedom promised to them if they fought in the armies for a certain period of time. And so many people joined against their will, others joined of their own volition in the hopes of achieving freedom, which they did. So it turns out the wars of independence, as well as the liberal ideas about freedom that accompanied independence, and which Afro-descendants helped to shape through their actions, really ended up eroding slavery significantly in this region, well before it was actually abolished in the 1850s and early 60s. So the service of Black men as soldiers was extremely important, and it was recognized by white Argentines at the time. This is something that is important to notice, that even though sometimes modern-day Argentines have forgotten this, this was not news to the people who were trying to liberate and build this new nation. So, for example, in the middle of the 19th century, once the wars of independence had been fought and Argentina was starting to get out of the internal civil wars, in which people of African descent also fought on both sides, Bartolomé Mitre, who was a leading writer and journalist and historian, and went on to become the first president of a unified Argentina, he was instrumental in kind of looking back and trying to write the history of this fledgling nation. And as he did so, even as he wrote about, the generals and the sort of more famous white men who had, fought in these battles, he made a real point to talk also about the contributions of Afro-descendants as soldiers. And as people who were able to rise in the ranks, not all the way to the top, but to the middle ranks of the military as well. And Mitre was instrumental in spreading the story of Falucho, who was a legendary Afro-Argentine soldier who sacrificed his life in the fight against the Spanish. And Falucho was likely a mythical character, but he was kind of a composite of lots of soldiers, and he stood for the sacrifice of an Argentine soldiering body that was significantly Afro-descendant. And so this was a way of acknowledging the fact that sort of the common soldier or the unknown soldier in Argentina was likely a person of African descent, or likely as not to have been a person of African descent. And in the late 19th century, the Afro-Argentine community of Buenos Aires built a statue to Falucho to kind of honor this foundational role that Afro-descendants had played in the nation, that they had, shed their blood for their country on multiple occasions. And it had enormous support from, people across Buenos Aires' society. So it was later, moved to a different part of town. It was originally placed in a very prominent part of town, right across from the statue of San Martin. The evolving sort of rise of white supremacy and racism in the early 20th century led that statue to be moved elsewhere, but that's a different story. And I wanted to say that women too served in this effort, not to the same degree as men, of course. Many of the women stayed behind, doing many of the jobs that men used to do in the cities. But some women went to war. They went to war as cooks and nurses and seamstresses and wives and companions and camp followers. But sometimes they also fought as soldiers. and they played an important role in strategy. And this was the case, the most famous example is a woman named Maria Remedios del Valle, who was an Afro-Argentine woman who joined the forces of General Belgrano and the Army of the North. And she has recently been memorialized with a statue in downtown Buenos Aires. So now sort of joining the statue of Falucho and showing the kind of the Black women's presence as well. But what I want to highlight from this, the reason all of this is significant is because it shows how deeply committed Afro-Argentines, both men and women, were to gaining the full rights of citizenship in Argentina, to helping Argentina become sort of a new nation. And then once it was a new nation, to participating actively through all kinds of forms of political participation, to argue for the ideas of equality and freedom and liberty that the nation supposedly stood for, right? So Afro-descendants were crucial in mobilizing voters for their political parties, different political parties, voting actively in elections. So there was actually quite wide suffrage in the 19th century for people of African descent, or they wrote fervently about politics in their own newspapers, in the newspapers of the Afro-Argentine community in the late 19th century. So their political involvement on all of these fronts deeply shaped Argentine public life in crucial ways at a very formative time in the nation's history.
Thank you very much for that. And now that we know that historical background and foundations and the many ways in which Afro-Argentines have contributed to the notion, of a national identity in Argentina, I'd like to kind of like take us to the musical perspective of this. So, Pedro, how do you think music has contested the erasure of Black people in Argentina? But most importantly, what has been that source of inspiration for you for the multicultural music encounters composition that you have been working on for June?
Well, first of all, hello, everybody. And Professor Alberto, that was beautiful, so thank you for that. And to answer your question, so I think music in its many different kinds of powers has been a very important tool in keeping the Blackness of Argentinian music, I wouldn't say in the forefront because that would be not very truthful, but present. Many of the rhythms that are kind of key, there are columns of the tango tradition, for example. There are three main columns, which is tango, milongas, and valses. And for the milongas, it's actually very evident the influence of African music. Not necessarily directly from Argentina, but there are elements from Habanera, from music from Cuba that eventually arrived. That is within the tango tradition. If you will look at the folkloric, what we call in Argentina folklore music, which is very different from tango, which is very urban music, folklore, which tends to be more rural, both in its kind of in its essence and audience. It is much more influenced through the north and the west, and from there we get also very evident influences of, for example, music of Afro-Peruvian music, for example, or Afro-Venezuelan, which are very noticeable. I mean, as I moved from Cordoba, I'm from Cordoba, Argentina, to New York, and I started playing all these different kinds of musics and styles from Latin America, I started to realize how closely related they were. I mean, there were many rhythms from the Afro-Peruvian tradition that either sounded very similar to rhythms in Argentina, like chacareras or sambas, spelled with a Z, unlike the very festive samba spelled with an S from Brazil. Also, when I played Venezuelan music and all the música llanera, music from the plains, I also realized that there were many elements that connected all these different nations through the blackness of their music. So I guess that in a way answers the first question. And for the second question, I, like many Argentinians of the 20th century and now 21st century, grew up in an environment that actually did, I think, a conscious effort to hide Argentina's blackness. I grew up my whole life without even hearing that there were Black people in Argentina of African descent. And so for me, when this project got offered to me, I was really moved and very eager to learn more myself about all of this, which I feel very ignorant about. So that took me to do some research and find a lot of testimonies about the experience of the Afro-Argentinians. And generally speaking, let me kind of hold back a tiny bit. Although there is, I believe in programmatic music, meaning music that references something in particular, I think I kind of believe a bit more in absolute music. And I think music has the power. I mentioned at the beginning what I said, the powers of music. I think music has a immense power to touch people in a very, very specific way that is wordless, unless, of course, we're talking about the song, right? I feel that's very unique and incredibly powerful. So even though the stories that I encountered many were very inspiring, and I was in a way tempted to kind of put a name to the piece that I was writing. After some thought and after actually already sketching the music that I'm in the process of writing at the moment, I decided to just address a bigger picture, which is what I heard many times in these different testimonies, which is I don't know if the word is resentful, but how people feel that they have been silenced of Argentinian descent. That was something that was recurring and infuriating at the same time. So I decided to focus my piece in that. It's actually kind of a growth. It starts with that image of frustration, of trying to be silent. And then eventually the piece grows into something more explosive at the end, which is hopefully kind of a part of the process of shining a light on this very important part of Argentinian history.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that Professor Alberto is very interested in that concept of silence. We talked about it the first time we had a conversation about Afro-Argentina, and I guess that this next question kind of like allows us to go into that and kind of also to move forward, because we have been talking a lot about the 19th century, the turn of the century, but what does it look like, as we move forward to be Black or Afro-descendant in Argentina? So to both of you, to Professor Alberto and to Pedro, what are some of those defining traits of Afro-Argentine culture that we can see today, not only in music, in the case of Pedro, but also in other forms of culture, in history, in the archive, in literature as well? How are these traits sustained today? You are muted.
I'm muted, sorry. Should I go first, or Pedro, would you like to answer first? Or
No, I think you're significantly more prepared to answer this question than I am.
I had actually, you just asked us to move beyond music, but I actually, the first kind of core form of cultural heritage that came to mind was, in fact, music. And I will say that there's a much broader panorama, and it depends how you define Afro-Argentine. I mean, Afro-Argentines today are not just the people who descend from the populations that were initially enslaved on Argentine territory, but there are people from the Cape Verdean Islands, whose ancestors migrated at the beginning of the 20th century. There are people from neighboring countries, right? Brazil, Uruguay, who have for centuries gone back and forth and created ties of family, other kinds of cultural connections. So in some ways, what is Afro-Argentine might include, religious manifestations that we associate with Brazil, for example, right? Like certain forms of candomblé, or so there are lots of different forms of Afro-Argentine culture depending on how we define it. There are also Afro-Dominican people and people from the Caribbean, right? But sort of strictly speaking, in terms of a tradition that developed on Argentine soil historically, I was going to point to the cultural heritage in music, and particularly the form of music and dance known as candombe, which is strongly associated with the Afro-descendant community, both in, on both sides of the Rio de la Plata, right? So in Uruguay and in Argentina. Candombe in some ways is one of those silenced heritages that, I was saying earlier that the Afro is not separate from the Argentine. It has become deeply fused into the Argentine, and sometimes in ways that people don't recognize. And candombe was a sort of influence, a direct influence in the rhythms that became the milonga and then the Argentine tango in many ways, right? So as Pedro was saying, part of the sort of the Afro-diasporic influences of tango come from the Cuban habanera, but they also come from the dances that were being, and the musical styles that were being developed in Buenos Aires and other parts of Argentina. So, it's known that Black musicians and composers and dancers were crucial in the development of the Argentine tango. That's pretty well acknowledged. I mean, there's some debate in terms of how much Black influence there is in the tango, but I don't think anyone would contest that there were really important composers, dancers, musicians, right, in the early tango and even well into the 20th century. But that's a story that's often forgotten, both because there was an effort from beginning in the early 20th century to erase the Black roots of tango as it became the kind of, the dance, the national dance of an Argentina that was imagined as very white and civilized along with sort of traditional European lines. But also the Black roots of tango have been lost to some extent because there was an effort to erase, or in other words, there was not an effort to kind of acknowledge the Blackness of those individuals, right? Over time, it becomes forgotten that certain people who contributed to the tango were people of African descent. So I wanted to think about candombe as something that did not sort of disappear in the 19th century, as has often been claimed, right? The idea is candombe was the musical dance practice of a population that just disappeared, and therefore it disappeared. And to the extent that it's alive today, some critics say, oh, it's because it's been re-imported from Uruguay, or it's been brought in from, it's copied from Brazil. But no, there was a steady tradition of candombe being played throughout the 20th century. And one of the exciting things that's I think happening in Afro-Argentine studies through archival history and through oral histories is that we're starting to figure out kind of how candombe remained in use and sort of evolved and was preserved by the community throughout the 20th century. So we've long known about one venue where it was danced from like the 1920s all the way through the 1980s and 90s, which was the Shimi Club, which was a gathering of the Afro-Argentine community in the basement of the Casa Suiza in downtown Buenos Aires on Rodríguez Peña. So we knew that, but we didn't know where else it was being danced and sung. And thanks to oral histories, we know that as the Afro-Argentine community was moved away from the center of Buenos Aires and to more sort of peripheral or marginal areas of greater Buenos Aires, they continued to gather and dance and play candombe. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. At the same time, in my own research, by following this central character in my book, Raúl Ligera, I found that he was helping to organize candombe dances in a theater on Avenida Corrientes, which is like the center of downtown Buenos Aires and the porteño nightlife, in 1915, right? So just at this time when supposedly tango was coming to the fore as the dominant form of Argentine dance, Black Argentines were gathering and dancing candombe. And there seems to be indications that they're dancing it in ways that is really starting to approximate what becomes the Argentine tango. So I think that this is one of the projects of one of the Afro-Argentine activist groups today, the Asociación Misibamba, is to kind of recover this particularly Argentine candombe that so many people said was lost and has ceased to exist over the course of the 20th century. So that's one place, I think, for thinking both about the transmission and preservation of something that is particularly Afro, but also the ways in which that nourished this broader sense of Argentine identity, right? What could be more Argentine than the milonga and the tango? So.
Pedro?
I will just add a tiny bit. There are actually at the beginning of history, the first pieces of music that were published had very important kind of caricatures that would describe not only often the piece that was published, that was being published, but also there are important documents to let us imagine what Buenos Aires of that time looked like and felt like. And there are many of these covers of sheet music that depict couples of Afro-Argentinians dancing really, really close together, which is one of the trademarks of Argentine tango. I mean, if you look to many of the dances throughout the world, but in Latin America, you're going to see, for example, salsa, or there's a certain distance, but tango is one of the most kind of intimate dances that you're really, really close to your partner, and that seems to be kind of a direct influence from the way Afro-Argentinians danced it back in the day. And now switching actually from the dance and now moving away from the Rio de la Plata area and going through the quote-unquote rest of the country, or el interior, where, as I mentioned earlier, we find the music that we call folklore. Over there, for example, the dance is very, very Spanish in its way. There are not a lot of elements from kind of Africa in that sense. I mean, you see all the way that people dress and dance is all very distant and kind of more formal, more kind of colonial. But the influence in the music is really present. And when you see all the very syncopated rhythms, unlike tango, which has its richness in the way in a different place in music. Folkloric music is significantly more syncopated, imitating more what the elements of African music in Latin America. So, and that's something that anywhere you go, and if you listen to folkloric music of Argentina, you're going to feel that syncopation. And once again, sorry to repeat myself, but if you go to Peru and you listen to the music there, you're going to see that they're all very closely related.
Thank you very much. And now I leave you with Leilah, who is going to continue asking questions to expand on the current affairs of Afro-Argentines?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm learning a lot. So here's your next question for Alberto. What do you think is the current state of Black citizens in the region, and what movements have come out of this?
Thank you for that question. I was thinking about this question ahead of time, and since you said the region, I was thinking about Latin America as a whole. So I thought I'd address a little bit, sort of broadly, what's going on in Latin America, but then focus in on Argentina a bit. But let me know if you want more information on Argentina. But in Latin America as a whole, the Durban Conference Against Racism that was held by the United Nations in South Africa in 2001 was a major impulse to Black movements across the region. So, different countries had different degrees of sort of organized and visible Afro-descendant movements. In Argentina, there had been some amount of mobilization sort of slowly after the return to democracy in the 1980s. But there was not yet a very significant movement compared to places, of course, like Brazil or Colombia or of course, Cuba. But this conference in 2001 really galvanized Afro-descendants throughout the region, and they met a year before that in Santiago de Chile to sort of prepare for how they would try to present, their demands in a kind of as unified as possible a way. And so one of the things that came out of this process of trying to kind of align demands was to choose a unified way to talk about people of African descent in Latin America, because as you may know, there's so many different ways of talking about people in different countries, local terminologies. In Argentina, for example, the word negro has a very negative charge. And so Argentines of African descent have avoided it significantly for most of the 19th and 20th century and called themselves gente de color, gente de la clase. In the colonial period, people used, or in the 19th century, people used pardo y moreno instead of negro y mulato, which were more linked to slavery. So anyway, one of the things that happens is that Black activists started to feel like, well, how could we be counted and seen as the large groups that we are in these populations if we can't find a unified way of referring to ourselves and being sort of made visible to the state? So they opt for this category of afrodescendiente, and that's actually a very powerful tool because it then links all of the countries in Latin America together and gives strength to some of the countries that have a smaller movement, for instance, Argentina. And they bring certain coordinated demands back from that conference to their national states. And so one demand is inclusion on national censuses. So one of the things that happens, the way people of African descent become sort of officially invisible in many countries, and Argentina is an excellent example of this, is that, in the colonial period, people used racial variables to count the population, but with the, onset of a national state that is liberal and Republican, race disappears from the census, right? And that had a kind of, in theory, inclusionary sort of intention, but at the same time, it also made it possible to say that there were no people of African descent in the country, right? So one demand is we want to be re-included on national censuses. There should be a race variable. And Argentina does this first as a pilot in 1910. It's just a very small pilot. It results in an undercount. But in the 2020 census, which was the results of which are still postponed because of COVID, there was actually a bigger push to make this cover the national territory. So we're still awaiting those results. Another thing that comes out of Durban is the demand for state-led reparations of different kinds. And again, this depends on the sort of the size and the power of these movements in different countries and the conversations that already exist about race and racism in those countries. But for example, In Brazil or Colombia, there's the recognition of rights to ancestral territories or land, affirmative action in jobs or education, so higher education in particular, right, college, and policies to teach content in schools about Africa and Afro descendants. And again, Brazil has a law to this effect, and there are several others being contemplated. And perhaps more diffusely, public policies that reaffirm the presence of Afro descendants in the history and culture of the country, past and present. And this is where I would say Argentina is still in this conversation of trying to make visible the population through the census and sort of re-include Afro-Argentines in, through recognition of their role in shaping Argentine culture. I mentioned that there was a statue to Maria Remedios del Valle recently built in Buenos Aires, the renaming of certain public spaces and institutions. But there's still a long way to go. If you look at, the conversation around race and racism in Argentina and a place like Brazil, right, where Afro descendants do not have to argue simply to have their existence recognized by the state, right? So in Argentina, it's a real uphill battle. And so I think there's a long way still to go, even though the Black movement is extremely dynamic and has been growing by leaps and bounds in the last few decades.
Thank you so much. I kind of want to shift the question to Pedro. So like about the music responses, and if there's any like Afro-Argentinian bands or music or artists that are participating in like the preservation of Black Argentine identity.
Well, that's not that I know of, but what has been happening a lot in the music environment in Buenos Aires and actually in the tango community in the world. Tango is a style of music that is appreciated all over the world. It doesn't matter where you travel. If you want to find a tango community, you will find it. And in the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years, it has been a very hot topic to finally recognize the Blackness of tango. If you see just any picture of Argentinian society, you're going to see that it's not very evident that the Blackness is something that has that shaped us. And there have been now several books actually written about the influences of Black musicians into tango. Which, for example, if you read the earlier books of tango, there is absolutely no mention of that. I mean, I'm not a very avid reader of tango books, but I remember reading two of them, and there was absolutely no mention of any of that. And now, if you read more current books, books that have been written in the last 2 decades or so, you're going to find that it's a very hot topic, and it's something that books have been written about it. And then in a more informal way, a lot of musicians have been addressing this and kind of in the music and in the way they present the music to the audiences. Once again, before it was something that was not talked about much. And nowadays, all the musicians are, not all, but most musicians are embracing this idea and, trying to shine a light on this element of our Argentinian music that has been hidden for so many years.
Thank you. Okay, so the last question will be to everyone. And it is, what do you think can be done on different fronts to advance the conversations around Blackness and Afro descendants in Latin America, specifically in Argentine context?
Well, I think, sorry if I take this. But I think what the multicultural music group is doing is a perfect example of what can be done to shine a light on this topic. I think to marry the idea of just exactly what's happening now. I have somebody very knowledgeable, as a Professor Alberto is, about this topic, and then eventually on June 16th, bring a kind of a whole visceral kind of aspect to this topic. I think it's an excellent way to shine a light on this topic and also have it be a visceral or emotional experience for the people, so that it leaves a mark rather than information. I don't know about you, but for me lately it's getting information and my brain lets it go almost immediately. So I think if we attach it to something emotional, I think it's a really, really great way to address issues like this.
Yeah, I agree. I think that combination of information, but also appealing to people's affect and sentiment, and is very powerful. And I think music can really do that. From my perspective as a historian, what I can offer is telling stories about the past and the present. And I think from that position, the greatest violence and the greatest impediment to equality and recognition for Afro-Argentines has been the constant denial of their existence, right? Or the silencing that Pedro was talking about. We probably grew up around the same time and never once taught about the history of Afro-Argentines in our schools. And this is just unconscionable. What does that mean for the people whose heritage is being completely silenced and who are almost being presented as an impossibility, right? So I think, obviously the Black movements in Argentina have been working on many fronts to increase visibility and get rights and be recognized at this government level. But Argentina has a population that is considered majority white, and so this is not a country like Brazil or Colombia, where the population is officially recognized either as a majority or as a significant minority, right? So I think those of us who are in that majority of people who self-identify as white in a country like Argentina have to use this kind of privileged position that we have to talk to our fellow nationals, to other Argentines, right? So Pedro is a Latin Grammy Award winner, and he can call people's attention through music to this history. I'm at a privileged US institution. I can write a book that hopefully speaks to my fellow Argentines and talks about these processes of invisibilization and their harmful outcomes, but also tries to put kind of new stories in place that emphasize Afro-Argentine presence, right? Not just talk about invisibility and absence and silence, but put new stories, new sounds, and help kind of amplify as much as possible the work that Black activists are doing in that regard. So yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to help bring that broader story and these new sounds to new publics here in the United States, but hopefully also our compatriotas in Argentina who may change their way of thinking about their country.
Perfect. That is great. And we would love to continue this conversation, but as we say, in Spanish, para dejarles con las ganas, so that you keep wanting more. But first and foremost, thank you so much to Pedro, Paulina, and Leilah for being a part of this conversation. And just know, to those of you attending, that this will be turned into a documentary about Afro-Argentina, which will be presented at the Multicultural Music Encounter on June 16, 2023 at 7 p.m. at Lovinger Theater, the Lovinger Theater at Lehman College. And we will be constantly communicating with you, reminding you of this very special celebration of this year's programming on Afro-Latin America and Afro-Latin American lives. To those of you participating in tomorrow's webinar on Afro-Peru, see you soon. If not, we will see you at the concert on June 16, where all of this conversations will come to life. Thank you very much.